Okay, I hope you had a good time discussing that. It's a really pretty interesting video, isn't it? And I think all of us probably have done, you probably don't get to the place you're at in life without having had some vision, but I think all of us probably have visions that are not as big as they might be because we haven't invested enough time really maybe thinking and praying about that. Okay, so we're going to do a quick overview of the 7 habits, and then we're going to just to review what we've already done, and then we're going to go into more detail with several that I think are more important. If you'll notice, there's 3 dots there, and the way Covey presents this in his book is to say we all begin as dependents. Would you agree with that? When we're children, when you're a baby, you're very dependent. As you get older, you put on your own shoes and tie them, and you gradually learn how to go to the bathroom by yourself and not have to have diapers and so forth. Eventually, as we grow all the way to adulthood, we should hopefully get to the place of going from being dependent to independent. Some of you have had the exciting journey of raising children. Now, this can sometimes be a challenging process to help your kids go from dependent to independent. In Covey's way of thinking about this, the first 3 habits deal with that transition, and they really are habits that deal with what he calls personal effectiveness. Okay? Habits 4, 5, and 6 are completely different because they don't have as much to do with personal effectiveness as interpersonal effectiveness. Now, both of those are important, but he argues, and I would agree, that you probably aren't going to be very good at interdependent kinds of effectiveness if you aren't already have your own act together. So developing habits 1, 2, and 3 is in some ways a prerequisite to being able to do effectively habits 4, 5, and 6. Okay, be proactive. We didn't, the little vignette that we had before the movie talked about being proactive, and it basically means what? What does it mean to be proactive? Let me give you a simple illustration. A proactive person thinks in their circle of concern. A reactive person thinks about a lot of things he can do nothing about. So the idea of being proactive is to say, I'm not going to spend a lot of time fretting about things I can do nothing about because it's just a waste of time, right? And that's tempting in today's world because the world seems to be having all kinds of issues, and there's all kinds of drama going on in our country at the political level and at the social level and so forth. But the things I can't change, it's a waste of time to worry about those and invest a lot in that. What I want to do is to say when things are really difficult, I need to look at what can I do personally, and then I need to concentrate on that. So that's what it means to be proactive rather than reactive. Reactive persons spend most of their time doing what? Griping and bitching and complaining about all the stuff that's a mess. And there's plenty of stuff to bitch and gripe and complain about. But that doesn't change anything. I think God would want us to be proactive rather than reactive, okay? The independent person, habit 2 we've already talked about, begin with the end in mind. That's really what the video was about. The video is really about what the power of vision. Vision is spending a lot of time thinking carefully about where am I going and how do I intend to get there. And I think we all do that at a certain level. But my guess is that for most people, we probably do too little of that. And we probably don't dream as big of dreams as we might, and we don't have as exciting a life as we could have had. I like one of my favorite songs comes from a musical, and it's called To Dream the Impossible Dream. Do you know that song? Yeah, I love that song because I want to dream big. If I dream big and get 90%, that's pretty good, or even 70%. If I dream little and get 100%, I probably have had much less rewarding and enriched life than I would have had. Okay, first things first. We'll be talking about that in more detail. And this is probably one of the big challenges that we have as professors, because there are too many first things. There's a lot of first things, right? And how do you juggle all of your first things? We'll get into that in detail. We'll spend some time talking about interdependence, and this is really learning to work effectively with other people. And without getting into the details, think win-win, seek first to be understood, to understand, then to be understood, and then synergize. And we'll go through those in more detail. And then this produces the interdependence or interpersonal effectiveness. Fair enough? So I can be really effective. When I was department head, as I got to know a lot of people in my department well, I knew most of them when I was department head, although I didn't even know everybody's names. It was such a big department, but I figured it out pretty quick. If I didn't know their name, it really hurt their feelings. So I made it a point to get everybody a picture and figure out everybody's names. But it was interesting to see that some people that were extraordinarily smart, extraordinarily capable, were incapable of working with other people. And so what they were able to accomplish was actually much less than what it would have been had they been able to not only be really smart and do certain things by themselves, but if they had been able to work effectively in a group situation, they probably could have multiplied a lot what they did. Some of them were pretty successful because they were just that smart, but they really lost some opportunities because they couldn't work with people, and sometimes they couldn't work with other people because they were selfish. You can't imagine that, can you, being around faculty, and they're never selfish. They're always altruistic, right? I'm obviously kidding. Okay, so let's begin with habit 2. Habit 1 was be proactive. We're not going to spend more time on that. Habit 2 is really, really important. Begin with the end in mind. As simple as this sounds, I think we often do this at either too low a level or maybe not do it with even a very careful, intentional, thoughtful process over time to figure out where are we going and what it is that we're trying to do. Our mission answers questions like, what is the purpose for my life? What things do I value? What kind of character do I want to be? Okay. Now, I'd like to, I'll read both of these in just a minute. This is my mission statement. Let me read that. I wrote this 30 years ago. Maybe more, 35. If you can guess my age, you realize I was halfway through my life at this point in time. So I didn't figure this out when I was a teenager, but I did figure it out before I was retired. My mission is to live my life on purpose, with purpose, using all of my potential to fulfill God's purposes for me. My mission is also to grow spiritually, intellectually, and in my relationships with my family and with my friends and acquaintances. Now, that doesn't sound very specific, does it? But a mission statement should be timeless. It says, for my whole life, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? Not what am I trying to accomplish this semester. So I like to think of my mission statement as being the general description of where it is how I want to invest my life, okay? Now, would that be the same every year? Well, you would think so, but not really. Because, for example, I was married 3 years before I had children. And all of a sudden, when I had children, then that changed some of the things. When I was an assistant professor, I had certain priorities. When I was an associate, I had different priorities. When I was a full professor, was that appropriate? Well, of course it was. As things change, I can take my mission and say, I like to think of my vision as my mission lived to the very best of my ability for the next 5 years. Where do I want to be, and what do I want to have accomplished? Okay, so my mission is my general compass of where I'm trying to go. My vision is, given where I'm at in my life's journey, what am I going to do the next 5 years? Okay? Does that make sense? Because that does change with time. Guess what? Mine is very different now that I'm retired than it was when I was working. I don't care how many papers I published this year. I don't care how much research funding my vision now is entirely different. And I think that at each stage of life that happens. We have, some books have said, 6 or 7 different stages of life, but I don't care what the number is. I think the importance is that these things are going to change. Now, begin with the end in mind needs to be, at the end, very specific. So if I say as an assistant professor, and I've got tenure that I'm working on, then 5 years is a pretty real timetable, isn't it? Because for most of us, that's the time period that you have to be on your tenure track. What is it going to take to get tenure at the school that I happen to be at? I'll tell you, if you don't already know that in great detail, you really need to ask a lot more questions, and don't be shy. When I was department head, for my department, I used to take the packages of successful tenure track people who had made it the preceding year, not just from our department, but from other departments across the College of Engineering. We would eliminate people's names and stuff, and also get their permission. This is what a successful tenure package looks like. Because I wanted them to know as specifically as possible what it takes. Now, every package was not exactly the same. So what that means, if you do more of this, you can probably get away with doing a little less of that. But I think, and that's why it's complicated sometimes, but I think that by hook or by crook, I made it easy for my faculty because I wanted them to have a clear picture of what they were shooting at. But if your school doesn't do that, you can still talk to, you probably have a tenured person who works as your advisor or helper, or you can go to the department head, but you really need to find out exactly what that looks like. If you're an associate professor who wants to become a full professor at some point, then again, you can look down the road and say, from where I'm at today, where do I want to be 5 years down the road? Now, when you do that, then you can say, if I'm going to be that far down the road in 5 years, how far down the road do I need to be this year? And then you can say, if I'm going to get this much done this year, how much do I need to do each week on average? Not every week's going to be the same. And then I can take my weekly commitments or my weekly goals and say, then what do I need to do each day? Now that's pretty simple, isn't it? I mean, you'd say, well, that makes common sense. How many people actually do that? It's a really, really interesting exercise, honestly, to really give some serious thought. You can't do this in 2 hours one afternoon. You need to think much more carefully, or what you're going to do is not going to be all that accurate and all that useful. But to live today in light of what I want to be 5 years from now, and to have that for the priorities that will help to bring that to pass, will never happen accidentally. It will only happen if you take the time to invest in thinking about where you're going so that I can learn to put first things first when I know what they are. Begin with the end in mind must precede doing first things first, because that's habit 3. You can't put first things first until you know what your first things are. And a lot of times we do this by what's urgent, not by what's important, as we'll see shortly. So my goal then is to say I want to live today in light of where I plan to be in 5 years. Simple concept. I know when the people read Covey's book, they said, well, this is silly. Everybody knows that. Yeah, almost nobody practices it. There were some interesting studies that were done, and I don't remember if I got those from Covey's book or some other book, saying they took kids who did this kind of activity as freshmen in college, and when they graduated, they tracked them. They did some surveys, and they got a big control group of people who were college students. They wanted to see how many kids actually did this, and did it make any difference in how they progressed after they got out of school. Okay? Only 3% of college students, and this was from an Ivy League school. Only 3% of the students did this. And when they graduated from college, they should have had what? Their 5-year plan. You should always have a 5-year plan. They were able to, I guess through the Alumni Association, keep track of these couple of hundred kids. And 20 years later, they were able to go back and say, how did they end up? And it was interesting. This is not necessarily the most important metric, but it's the easiest one to quantify. How'd they do financially? The top 3%, or not the top, the 3% who actually did this made more money than the 97% put together, which is to say they were extraordinarily successful. Now, again, I don't say that making money is the highest way to measure that, but it is an indication. Probably in other areas they had the same sort of result. If you think carefully of where you're going and work through, where do I want to be 5 years from now? In an ideal situation, where would I ideally want to be? What do I have to be doing then this year to get 20% of the way down that road? What do I need to be doing this week? Therefore, what must I be doing on Monday? Now, that takes a little bit of careful thought, but once you've done that, guess what? You become really, really focused, and all of a sudden, you're really focusing on doing the things that are important and not just the things that are urgent. I like to think of, as a Christian stewardship, Psalms 90:12 says, "What, Lord, teach us to number our days that we may present to thee a heart of wisdom." Every day is a gift, okay? Ephesians 5:15 and 16 says, "Walk as wise men, making the most of your time." I like to think of each day as being, each day that we live is a gift from God. What we do with that day is our gift back to Him. And then one that's a famous cliche, which I didn't make up, but I like. We don't plan to fail, we just fail to plan. Now, I can tell you, I know from my own struggles, but by doing annual reviews for 67 faculty every year, you learn a lot about people, and you say, there's some really smart people that just don't do any of this stuff, and therefore they are much less effective than they might have been. I think the crucial commitment that is evidence that you're really doing this is weekly planning on Sunday. Getting your big rocks into the jar before you allow any sand. Did we get a video on that? Okay. I'm going to show you a really cute video in a minute. I'll come to it that illustrates this in a neat way. But I can tell you, if you're not doing weekly planning, then you're not doing this. And if you're not doing this, you're really missing a good bet. You aren't going to have the balance in your life that you want to have. You'll be over-invested probably in some things, particularly your job, and under-invested in other things. And you'll also probably over-invest in the wrong things, even in your job. So you don't want to make those mistakes. I won't ask you to raise your hands how many of you had planned this week carefully what you did and then followed the plan. So you want to use your begin with the end in mind, weekly commitments to determine your big rock. So let me see if we can put that illustration up here. Randy, I'm not sure. Huh? Oh, okay. Then we need to get out of here and you can scroll. Oh, okay, we'll just yell. Go down.
Your name is?
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth. You have a work life?
I do.
This is Stephen Covey.
Family life as well?
Mm-hmm.
Children?
Not yet.
Not yet. What's the nature of your work assignment?
I direct an international firm.
An international firm? Mm-hmm. So you really are interfacing with all kinds of people in the firm and outside the firm.
That's right.
You want a rich personal life and a rich family life. Do you ever feel like you get bogged down in the thick of thin things?
Yes.
Well, that might be analogous to all these little, small things that tend to fill our life. And that just little by little, they just accumulate. Now, your job, you can't go above this, is to get all those large rocks in the jar. Good luck. What's that one called?
Q2, planning, preparation.
Right. Planning, preparation, prevention, and empowerment. Mm-hmm. Okay, the next rock she's putting in there is called relationships and family. You didn't look at that third rock you put in there. That's employment, some key employment issue, and then you put major projects here. I can't get it above there.
I haven't worked it yet.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. That's called Service Community Church. Do you ever feel like this?
Yes.
How many feel like this? By moving the little things around, you might squeeze in one more of those big major things. It's almost. Wow, that is good. You know, if it doesn't fit, force it. Here's something that's called urgent and important. It's a quadrant 1 thing that is blindsiding you that It's your biggest client that if you don't get back to that client now, you've given up your vacation.
No.
And you have no special block of time just for yourself. I'll tell you what you can do if you want to.
What's that?
You can take a whole different approach. You have a totally fresh bowl. You can work out of a different paradigm altogether.
Well, then I'd rather put these in the bottom and then pour the little pebbles on top.
Employment,
Big opportunity,
big opportunity.
important and urgent, block of time. Those young children keep looking at me. Glad my husband's not here. Now I dump these in there.
Okay? That's great. That's great.
Okay, do you get the point? This has to do with what? Putting your big rocks for this week ahead into the jar. The jar represents the time you have for this coming week. And you're going to put the big rocks in the jar when? Yeah, on Sunday. Sometimes really you don't do it till Monday, and then you don't do it till Tuesday, and then all of a sudden it's Thursday, and you have 2 days left, and you have 4 days worth of big rocks, right? The only way you're going to get your big rocks done is to put them, allocate time for each one of them at the beginning of the week before all these other, now what do the little green rocks represent? That represents all of the other things that interrupt and distract us as we go through the week. And I think it's one of the challenges of being a faculty member. You really run a three-ring circus to some degree. And if you don't have a clear sense of what's the big rocks and the most important things vis-a-vis what are the sort of accidental interruptions that can take up lots of time, but at the end of the day don't accomplish the things that you were trying to do. Hang on just a second. Let me. Okay, here's another Covey concept that I think is very helpful. Time management quadrants. Now, if you look at your time management quadrants, the not important on the bottom, okay, the not important on the bottom is here and here. So this is the quadrant of not important, okay, but urgent. This is the quadrant of not urgent, not important, and then at the top you have what? The quadrants of important and urgent, and this would be the quadrant of not urgent but important. Now, where do you spend your week? If you looked at that and just tried to decide how your time gets spent, if you're spending a lot of time in quadrant 1, is that good or bad? It's not good. It's easy to be there because if I have too many urgent things, it means what? I have not been planning ahead and all these deadlines come at the same time. I have to say, as a college student, I never ever did an all-nighter. I just didn't think studying after midnight was effective for me. If I wanted to try to catch up, I would go to bed and get up at 5 o'clock. But I never did an all-nighter. But I have to say, in my early days as a professor, I did all-nighters. Why? Because I had deadlines on research proposals that had to be in. And I once did from Monday morning until Wednesday afternoon without any sleep. But that was before I learned all this stuff I'm talking about now. And it was probably what helped motivate me to not want to do that again. Okay, so the things that are in quadrant 1 are the things you have to do. They're both important and they have deadlines. So that ends up getting top priority. Quadrant 2 are the things that are important but are not urgent. What would be some examples of the things that are not urgent but are important. That would be things like working on my research project, writing a proposal a month ahead of the due date, and so forth. Why? So I'll have plenty of time to do it carefully and not have to be rushing it at the last minute and then doing a crummy job on getting it done. Writing papers. There's a lot of things that come into, ideally, I would like to spend all of my life where? In quadrant 2. Now, that's not really realistic, to be honest, because some of my urgencies I didn't create. Some of them are created by my boss, right? And other people around me, maybe. But the goal for me is I would like to live my whole life in quadrant 2 to the extent that that's possible. Now, quadrant 3 is things that are urgent but not important. What would be some examples of that? I think reading email to some degree falls into that category because you can spend a ton of time reading email, and most of the email I get, sadly, is not important. You have that problem? I don't know how to set my filters because I'm afraid I'm going to miss something and I'll have too much junk coming through. But, and then you have quadrant 4, which is things that are neither urgent nor important. What would be an example of something in there? Late night watching television, right? I don't care what's on. When you should be getting your sleep, well, I'm just kind of too lazy to get up off the couch, and so you're, and maybe what you're watching is not all that good. It just is what's available, right? If I'm intentional, I think there's nothing wrong with watching television if I'm doing it intentionally, and that means I'm finding some really good movie or program that's on, or some really interesting news show that's talking in a serious way about things that are going on. It's not that watching television is always bad, but I think that a lot of the television I watch is bad. I mean, it's a waste of time. It's not bad in the sense that it's gross. It's just bad in the sense that it's mind-numbing, and it helps me to become, what were we saying for quadrant 1? I want to be, it makes me reactive. I want to be proactive. I want to think in my circle of concern. Most of the junk on television is where? In my circle of things that I really can't do. Now, how about something like watching a football game on television? How would that fit? Where would that be? 4. Does everybody agree? I would disagree. I would disagree in this sense. You don't have to be a football fan, but suppose it's the Super Bowl and we get together with a bunch of friends and we have a potluck dinner and we have just a wonderful time of fellowship together. I think there are some circumstances where it could be, but it needs to be more carefully thought out. If I'm doing what I call passive television watching, where I just fall on the couch and turn it on because I just want a break from the real world, that's probably a quadrant 4. But there are many times when watching either television or going to a movie can be very positive if I've thought very carefully about what is it that I want to watch. I think they tape Billy Graham's funeral. I would love to get together. We have some friends that get together for Bible study stuff once a week. And you can do some things on television that are quite rewarding, but you have to be selective because there's a lot of stuff that is, in fact, a waste of time. If I'm with my grandkids and we watch a really good movie that has a lot of interesting ideas to talk about or it affirms good values, then that would be something that would be more like a quadrant 2. Now, they did a study of companies that, I'm sorry, I'm one slide ahead of myself. Okay, so I would say most teaching activities come in quadrant 1. Would you agree? They are urgent because when it's time to go give your lecture, you can't say, well, I'm in quadrant 2. And it's not a quadrant 2 activity, I think a lot of us, and it's perfectly okay, I think a lot of us do just-in-time lectures, and maybe if you've taught the course several times, that's about all you need to do. But I think a lot of teaching activities are urgent because they come when? How many hours a week you teach? 9, 6, 12, however many. So that automatically is urgent in the sense that you can't do it at another time. Okay. Hopefully the preparation is done as quadrant 2. But the going to give the lecture, good or bad, is quadrant 1. Now, would you agree that most research activities are quadrant 2? Well, they have to be because they're not things that get done in an hour or in a day. And I think one of the challenges that we have, particularly in our profession, is that there is this tension between teaching activities which are urgent and are always the hounds are at my heels, and research activities which maybe have a year, 2 years, and if you're starting tenure, 5-year horizon. And how do you balance those? Because the temptation is to do what? Well, it's urgent, I've got to do this, and so with my research, well, I will do it tomorrow or next week or next semester, and you do that for very long and you get yourself into a pretty deep hole. And so I think, again, one of the benefits of trying to be much more thoughtful and intentional in thinking through, where do I want to be 5 years from now? What I have to accomplish this year in terms of my teaching and my research, and I'm talking in teaching, getting good reports on your teaching evaluations and so forth. And then thinking about what must I be doing this week? If I can break it down to this week and then put my rocks in my jar on Sunday afternoon, then I'll be doing on Monday exactly what I should be doing in light of where I hope to be 5 years from now. Wouldn't that be neat? If you could do that every day, guess what? You're almost certainly going to get there. But if you don't do that, then you're going to end up spending way too much time doing things that are not as important at the expense of things that are important, and you need a game plan to help you not do that. Again, this is common sense, but it's not common practice. I think a lot of us do kind of random sort of scheduling in our heads and then continuously modifying it all the time. And what happens? All the urgent things get done, whether they're important or not, at the expense of the important things, but the things that aren't due today or this week. So that's the challenge. Quadrant 3, many service activities. I think particularly if you're working on tenure, it's good to do some service, but don't overinvest in that. Frankly, it's the universities I've worked at, and these were all universities that had a reasonably high expectation in the area of research. They always say service is good, but if you spend too much time doing service, they won't count that as an extra paper or an extra research grant or other things. And so particularly until you get tenure, you should really do enough to do your part, but don't overinvest in that would be my recommendation. I think reading emails, I continually try to figure out a better way to do that, and I put more and more things on block, or I don't ever want to see this again. There's ways you can sort of make some of that go away. But what are some other examples of things that you can think of that are things that seem important but really aren't? They're just urgent. Well, the details, everybody's are probably different, but you need to start thinking in those terms. Am I doing this because it's urgent, or am I doing it because it's really important? Because there are some urgent things that I maybe don't even have to do, and I'm just doing it because I'm not really paying better attention. Okay, they did studies with companies that are highly successful compared to ones that are not, and they surveyed the employees there. And the idea was to say, how much time did they spend in quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4? Now, the top numbers, the bigger numbers and the top numbers were the successful companies. Interestingly enough, the successful and unsuccessful spent about the same amount of time doing urgent things. And in a way, that's not surprising because probably companies on average have about the same amount of urgencies from one company to the next. But look at quadrant 2. This is the quadrant of doing what? Things that are important but not urgent. Okay, the successful companies, their employees on average spent between 65 and 80% of their time. The not very successful companies spent 15% of their time. Now the question is, well, what were they doing? Because they did about the same amount of time in quadrant 1. Look at quadrant 3. The successful companies only spent 15% of their time in quadrant 3, where the unsuccessful companies spent 50 to 60% of their time. So I think you can see here, and then quadrant 4, less than 1%, and 2 to 3%. So the big differentiator is what? Are you doing more things that are urgent but not important? Or are you doing more things that are important but not yet, I like to say not yet urgent, because the important things I'm doing at some point have deadlines, right? And so that's really what probably will differentiate between professors who are more successful and professors who are not as successful. And I can tell you, I knew some really smart people that were in my department, but they never had enough to show for it because they spent way too much time doing things that were not important, that were urgent but not important. And we need to learn to think in those categories and use those kind of filters, because if you really, it's an interesting thing to try. and I've done this before, and it's very sort of telling and convicting. Keep a time schedule, a time track, not a schedule. Keep track of your time hour by hour for a whole week at work, and mark off on this quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. And then at the end of the week, you can sort of add up and say, where am I spending most of my time? And you will probably think you're doing better than you are. We all have that tendency. If I'm guessing what I weigh, it's always more than I think. If I'm guessing on a whole bunch of things, I always sort of think I'm doing better than I am. But doing a time log is something, if you go to any time management course, they will always recommend is a good starting point. I would highly recommend that you consider doing a time log for this coming week. And if you did that, then it would probably help you to say, oh my, at the end of the week, I've really spent a lot of stuff doing the little green bubbles, and all my big rocks didn't really get much attention. And it will be highly motivational then to say, I need to go and try to apply some of the things that we're talking about. There is an investment to get started, right? Because you're going to have to think about, where do you want to be 5 years from now? What do you want to be doing, therefore, this year? What must I then get done this week, and what then should I be doing on Monday, okay? Boy, if you really put that much thought into what you're doing, guess what? You'd spend a lot of time doing the high payoff things and spend a whole lot less time doing the things that truly are simply a waste of time. And again, time is a gift that God gives us. What we do with that, I think, needs to be much more mindful than we sometimes are. Okay, the big rock illustration. Well, we already did that. But don't you think that's a good illustration of this whole concept? You want to put your big rocks into your weekly schedule on Sunday when that jar's empty, and then you don't have to worry about filling up the rest of it. The green stuff will come. The green gravel will be there, and it'll fill up all the unscheduled time. But you want that to be the way this gets done. Okay, what did I miss here? Hang on just a second. Okay, maybe that is blank spaces. Oh.
Your name is?
Sorry, we already did that. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's try next to do habits 4, 5, and 6. Okay? Habits. Okay, we're doing pretty good on time. Habit 4 is what? Think, win. You've probably heard that concept before. This is not original with Covey. It's like a lot of things Covey has in his book. Say, well, that's not original. Well, no, but he ties a lot of things together in a good way. What does win-lose mean? I'm in the process of selling my house, and if I think win-lose, I'm going to try to get as high a price as I can, maybe one that's even a good bit higher than market, because I want to get more, and if I can find somebody who's dumb enough to pay more, then I'll do that. That's thinking win-lose. Do you ever work with faculty that want to do that? They want to do a joint research project with you, and they want to do 20% of the work, and they want to be the first author. Have you ever had that happen? If you haven't, you're pretty lucky. You must not be working with anybody because there are plenty of people that think win, lose. Yeah, sure they do. Now, I'll give you an example of my own, which I was embarrassed about because I'd been doing the Covey seminars at A&M for 10 years, and then I fell into one of these traps. I had a really good idea for a proposal. I needed to use some equipment that was in a different department, not in my department, but the university had bought the equipment, but there was a professor there who was kind of the overseer of it. So I'm writing my proposal to NSF, and I go over to talk to him, and running the equipment wasn't all that difficult, so I really didn't want him to be a co-investigator because it means that I was planning on getting $250,000, and I thought, if he's in there, then he'll need some of that, and then I'll get less. So I kind of thought, since I don't really need him, I just need the equipment. And so I tried to explain to him that I'd like to use the equipment and what would the use fees be and so forth. And he said, well, he'd be interested in working on a proposal. And I'm thinking, well, I don't really think that's necessary. And we were kind of going back and forth. He finally said, okay. So he said, you can use the equipment at $75 an hour. And I went, now that's a ripoff. The university bought this equipment, and it doesn't have any sort of incremental cost. And I was tempted to go to the dean's office and complain and say, you bought this guy won't let me use the equipment, you know. And I probably could have had the dean would have said, well, that's really bad, we paid for it. And he would have made him let me use the equipment. He'd have probably sabotaged it. But then I got to thinking, you know, what I'm offering him is a win-lose. So I went back over and I said, you know, I've been thinking about it, and probably having you on the proposal might actually be helpful, but on just the use of the equipment. And he, oh yeah, he was very interested. And so we co-wrote the proposal, and we wrote in some stuff for his part. And then when we got to doing the budget, and we said, what's it going to cost now for the equipment use fees things? And he says, oh, there's really no charge. This, you know, I think he forgot he told me $75 an hour previously, but he said, it's not a problem. So we wrote the proposal, and we also asked for $375,000 instead of $250 because there were two of us. I wasn't sure they would buy that. And they not only bought it, they didn't even try to nickel and dime us. If you've ever done NSF, they often fund it, but they want to take about 10 or 15% off. They assume there's that much fat in there. They funded the whole thing, $375,000, and so it didn't cost me anything. $125 was for him, $250 was for me, because I was doing the main part of the work. And then when we got to doing the project, it turned out there were some subtle things that he had more experience in and more expertise than I did, and his being part of it ended up being much more than just the use of the equipment. He actually added some intellectual value to the project as well. And we ended up doing some really neat stuff, and even got a joint patent on the thing. Now that's a good example of where I actually had a win-lose, that when I finally woke up one day and realized, you know, you're such a hypocrite going around telling people you shouldn't be offering win-lose deals, and that was exactly what I'd offered him. And it turned out to be a win-win, even a much bigger one than I would have thought. There was all kinds of synergy there that I didn't imagine. Now what's a lose-win? Okay, so you're selling your house, and you're anxious to sell it quickly, and so you end up lowering the price much below the market value just to move it, and that ends up being a lose for you and a win for somebody else. Now, you can do this in deals you make when you're doing partnerships in your research, can't you? You work together, and you do most of the work, and the other person somehow takes most of the credit, and then you do this over and over again. That's just having a lose-win mentality. It's kind of, I take any deal, no, good or bad, you know, and I don't care if it's not fair. So, but then that's not really the way that you want to do, and it builds resentment. So the real deal is to say, let's try to get a win for me and a win for you, and let's talk honestly about what a win for you looks like. Habit 5 is what? Seek first to understand, then to be understood. And that's really crucial here, isn't it? Because I need to know what a win was. I found out for the friend that I had, or it wasn't a friend, just an acquaintance in chemical engineering, I found out what the win was for him, and I thought it was reasonable, and so that's how we put together our win-win proposal. He understood he wasn't the main principal investigator, but he also wanted to be involved in a meaningful way, and so we got a win-win, and it turned out to be a real win. Now, can you always get to win-win? No. There are times when there's just not, it doesn't work. Either it's going to be a win for me and a lose for you, or it's going to be a lose for you and a win for me. There just isn't enough synergism there to make the thing work. Sometimes 1 + 1 = 3, but sometimes 1 + 1 = 1.5. And it just depends. For example, if I were going to do a project that's very experimentally oriented, but I need some modeling in there, and it would be helpful to have somebody who's a little bit more expertise in modeling than I have, then we can work out a win-win pretty easily because we complement each other. I can do this, the other person can do that. And that's how you get to win-wins. But suppose I talk to somebody who's a good friend of mine, and I'm doing a very experimentally intensive project, but that's what he does as well, or she does as well. And we just can't find a way to say, you know, if we do this, 1 + 1 is not going to get twice as much work done. and I can't get twice as much money for the project, therefore. So, in fact, it could end up being a lose-lose, or, well, you get the point. So I think you should not always assume people always act like it's better to work in groups, and I would say not necessarily. Sometimes it's a hindrance to work in a bigger group, because what you need is, if you don't have a team that has the right variety of talents and gifts, it doesn't work. Football team doesn't need 5 quarterbacks, it needs 1. And it needs some big, beefy people to be the line people and some fast people to be the receivers. And when I think of research collaborations, I want it to look like a football team, where it's not all receivers, it's not all quarterbacks, it's not all running backs. And that's not always the case. So if you can't find that, then this doesn't work. In synergism, we're talking about what? The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. In the illustration that we did at the very beginning, they had what? 0 plus 0 equals 5. It was one guy sitting on the shoulders of the other guy so they could reach the fruit. An ideal synergism is where you're working with people that have complementary talents and gifts. And I think it's really important as you're putting together a team to think of that. When I was first asked to be department head, I'm a really good big picture person. I'm a really terrible details person, as my wife will agree. So I had an associate department head and administrative assistant who are extraordinarily gifted in that area. I could have said, I just want big picture people like me, because I think big picture people are really, pretty important in this kind of a job. Well, no. I needed people that were very different from me, and so I chose people who were strong in the areas that I was weak, because they could cover my rear, right? And I could do the part I did well, and they could do the part that they did well. Again, no win-win without synergy. No synergy, no deal. So be careful not to get into these kind of collaborative works within your departments that really don't make any sense. And then you're frustrated and they're frustrated, and you're going to both put in a lot of time, and the payback's going to be maybe 3/4 of what your time was worth and 3/4 of what their time was worth. Okay, hopefully you can see this, and it's easy to fall into those. Okay, sharpen the saw. What is that about? Now, I didn't end up finding from the Success for Students program that we developed for college students, but we had a cute illustration, and I couldn't find a DVD for that. We have thousands of them someplace, but I couldn't find one. Okay, so let me just share with you what this is. It shows 2 people going out to chop wood, and it's a smaller lady. These are cartoon characters. It's not real people. And a great big guy. Now, they both start chopping wood, and at the end of about 50 minutes in the video, it just takes a few minutes in the video, she takes a break, and the guy doesn't. And he looks at her, and she's taking a break, and then again in the next hour, after about 50 minutes, she takes a 10-minute break. And he really is kind of irritated, because she's taking all these breaks, and he thinks that she shouldn't be. He's not taking any breaks. He thinks it's better not to take breaks, right? You just keep working. But he doesn't notice that by the end of the day, she has chopped a lot more wood than he has, and he's about twice as big as she is. And he kind of goes over and complains to her, how did you chop so much wood when you were taking all those breaks? And she said, well, if you'd been watching, when I was taking a break, I was sharpening my axe. Okay, so he's chopping with a dull axe. She's chopping with a sharp axe. And obviously, even if you're not as big, and even if you only chop 50 minutes per hour, you can chop more wood. So it's a really cute illustration. And I think if we get into real specifics here, how many of you get 8 hours of sleep a night? I want to ask you to raise your hands. But it's very, I think, well documented that the less you sleep, the less alert you are, your what I'm going to call functional IQ goes down. And some of you, if you get 3 or 4 hours sleep, you are not nearly as smart, and you're not nearly as effective as when you get 8 hours of sleep. But I know very few faculty that get 8 hours of sleep. I know I had faculty in my department who didn't take vacations. Now, I thought that was pretty extreme when I did their annual review, and I knew they could carry over some of that time. If they didn't take their time this year, they could carry it over. But then some of them would get to where they were at the limit of what you could carry over. And when we would have their annual review, I would ask them, are they going to take a vacation this year? Well, no, I don't have time. I got to do this and I got to do that. And I would basically show them this video and say, who are you in this picture, you know? And they would go, yeah, I think I'm the guy, you know. And I said, you're right. Go take 2 weeks of vacation. You think you don't have time to do that, but when you come back with a sharp axe, you're going to be a lot more effective. So whether it's getting 8 hours of sleep a night, whether it's taking some quality time off to go do things with your family, whatever, I think that we need to learn to do things that help us to sharpen our axe. How many of you get exercise 4 or 5 times a week? Anybody? A few of you? Okay. Oh, that's surprisingly many. It's 20%. I would have thought it could have been 10. Now, I tell students this, but it also applies to professors. Why is exercise important to your academic pursuits? Because people think there's a total disconnect. When you exercise, you generate more oxygen in your bloodstream and therefore more oxygen availability to your brain. It turns out that that higher oxygen level kind of exponentially decays over a period of a couple of days. And so what that would suggest is, ideally, you should at least exercise in an aerobic way every 2 days. And the time that you spend exercising will be more than paid back by the fact that you work much more quickly. So when people say, I don't have time to exercise, I say, well, it's because you don't get enough sleep, you know? Or you don't get your work done more quickly because you don't exercise. The idea that you're somehow going to do better by never exercising, never getting enough sleep, and your poor brain is just kind of, you know, numbed almost, and then you get your work done at a very slow pace. It's a false economy to think that you can lead an imbalanced life by not eating right, not exercising, not doing the things that are essential to keep your axe sharp. And furthermore, it's actually a lot more fun to feel good. If you're dragging through every day, and I know that we all have a tendency to do that because we get behind and we're overloaded, we didn't plan our semester, we didn't plan our week, and now we're in a big bunch of trouble, and we think we're going to make up for it by not sleeping and by not exercising. That doesn't even work then, does it? Because you're going to be going through it, instead of having your functional IQ of 120, you'll be at about 80, and you'll be wondering why the work is going so slow. I used to be smarter than this, right? And so I think this whole idea of saying there are a bunch of things in life that are important, and it's not just writing papers, and it's not just grading final exams. If you lead a balanced life, you will be a much better professor, you'll be a better spouse if you're married, you'll be a much better parent if you have children, and you'll just enjoy life more. It really is what I think we should do, but it's not necessarily what we do. Okay, so we're actually to break early. 5 minutes early. Do I get it back in the afternoon? Okay. So we've got some discussion questions from the 7 habits for you to work on at your table. And again, these are suggestions. If you have other interesting things you want to talk about in your class, that's fine. But I think these will be some things that are worth visiting about too. Discussion questions from 7 habits.